Islam basically is acceptance. And this acceptance is not exactly identical with the Christian faith. Islam has, that's what interests me very much in the Islamic perception of the mystery. I would say is more open to the mystery. That God can also destroy. There's no happy end guaranteed.
Welcome to Psychology and the Cross. In this episode, I talk to Jungian analyst and scholar of Islamic studies, Bernard Sartorius. Bernard holds a degree in theology from the University of Geneva and is a training and supervising analyst at the International School of Analytical Psychology in Zurich. In this episode, we discuss individuation and Islam, the attitude of psychological agnosticism, and the motive of surrender, in the context of a dream that Jung shares in the biography Memories, Dreams and Reflections. We also return to Jung's statement, "I don't need to believe, I know," when asked in an interview at the end of his life if he believes in God. But let's start from the beginning. How did it all begin?
It was in high school that I discovered my interest within a Christian type of movement of high school students, my interest for theology. But because we started to look at the Bible, and I was particularly interested by the figure of Jesus, but not of Jesus Christ as a mythological figure, but as a very inspired, very, very highly inspired human being, saying most important things for our psyche. I already felt it at that moment. And this led me then to study theology. I had a choice. I had another option, which was also attracting to me, and which was medicine. And I was hesitating till the last moment. I was even enrolled in the medical faculty, but then I changed into theology because I noticed that the spirit of medicine was a purely scientific spirit. And I felt right away already then that there was something excessive in this way of looking at reality. At the end of the studies, we have to write a diploma paper. And I did this in America in a Russian Orthodox seminary. I had chosen a topic which, by the way, was not so far away from a theme of our discussion today, the divinization of man, the deification of man, according to a Greek father whose name was Gregorios Palamas. I wrote this thesis, this topic, and then I got a scholarship to do this, to write this thesis within the framework of a Russian Orthodox institution. And I had a glorious year, I must say, in this St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary close to New York. Where I was all the time with the future priests of the American Russian Orthodox churches. There were many students and very American boys, but at the same time very, very pious for Orthodoxy, going to the choir, singing in the choir. I was also part of it, and going every Sunday to the parishes to sing in the liturgy. And the boys, it was not my case because I had my girlfriend in Switzerland, but there was the boys, they were so happy to go to the parish because they had a chance to meet their future wives. So during the time they were singing, they were already looking at the young parishioners in order to have the tea later. So it was a very nice, a very human kind of thing at the same time. Very, very different from the Calvinistic type of situation in which I was in the faculty in Geneva, theological faculty of Geneva, very strict, very Calvinistic, very intellectual. The Orthodox Church, in its especially with its beautiful music and through the icons, touched me very, very, very deeply at that moment. I did not think about the conversion because it was not to that point that I would go into another institution, but I felt that from henceforth something which was not also involving our symbolic reception of the mystery was not my way anymore. So in fact, I then left more or less inside. I left the Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church. Though, as I came back from America, I had to work for 7 years in this church because for financial reasons. At the beginning, I was working in the parish, and then I was working with youth work. It was easier. And during this time, I did my studies at the Jung Institute.
Shortly about this transition or deciding to study, was that a long process? Was it something?
This was a long process because I realized that I knew it already, as I just told you, that I was not going to work in the church, but I had to work in the church, and for some time I had absolutely no alternative professionally. I thought for some time that I would work as a teacher, a history teacher, because theologians could for some time work in the high schools in Geneva, but then this was closed. One could not have access anymore unless one had a PhD in philosophy. Anyway, so this was locked, and I was at the same time in a very existential, deep crisis, what my whole life, in fact, was concerned, and that's where I started analysis with Marius von Franz. First with Dieter Baumann, the grandson of Jung, and then with Marius von Franz. And that's where, in fact, in this process, that I discovered, I would say very deeply, that this was going to be my way to become an analyst. It was then, of course, the classic process that the dreams were supporting it, the orientation was supporting it. I was getting much better psychologically, as I had found this way, and so then it was clear that I was entering the Jung Institute, still while working in the church, because for years I had absolutely no money. My parents had no money to give me, and so I had to work continuously in the church.
And you mentioned it before that your interest during your theological studies and the research around the divinization of man or the deification of man that might link to the theme of today. And I was wondering, if you could say something about that link. I guess what comes to my mind is, Jung's idea or the process of individuation.
It's very fascinating that you ask this question, because it is, in fact, I find it also fascinating that it was already at this time, I was 23, in fact, an issue, you see, for me. This question of divinization, of divine energies, as it was called technically. My thesis was around a Greek church father. His name was Gregorios Palamas, of the 12th century, and he tried. And then, of course, in my thesis, I just explained how he tried this. I had no connection with Jung at this point, so I could not make any kind of parallel at this point. But he tried to make the distinction between the energies coming from God, which are in human being, and which give him life, which gives him the spirit, which give him the soul, which give him the sense of beauty, which give everything which makes a human being, and the essence of God himself, who remains completely unknown and in another reality and cannot be grasped in any way through our knowledge. So he tried to work on this distinction between divine qualities which have become human, which of course have first of all been expressed in the figure of Jesus Christ, real man, real God, but then who are given to a certain extent to every human being to share in his psychic life, and while keeping the mystery of the transcendence completely unspeakable completely untouchable and completely mysterious.
And what would you say that individuation is a process of man realizing his or her divine nature, or is that taking?
Yeah, divine nature, but then not in the sense of something only good, as we imagine it. No, no, no. I mean, not becoming oneself, but this can be also absolutely horrible. Can be very destructive for mankind or for people. So I'm personally very, very suspicious of any kind of idealization of the individuation process. That it would go into some kind of perfect man kind of direction. This I'm very, very suspicious now. But it's not realistic. It's very simple. It's not true. It's an idealization. I mean, there is a colleague, I don't want to mention him now because it was not published. He gave a description of individuation process which ends with some kind of perfect man, completely unrealistic, well connected to himself, knowing well his shadows, and of course connected erotically to his anima, and this, I don't believe in that anymore.
So what's the value of this term in your mind, individuation? What value does it have for you?
It has the value of something very, very open, absolutely open, and in the sense of basically different between each person, from person to person. And having to very, very much to do with becoming oneself without possibility to say what this means. Because this becoming oneself means something different for each person. So I cannot make a general definition. I would even not really anymore give too much value to clinical criteria, which could some people believe that they would indicate how far the individuation process of somebody has gone. I don't believe in that anymore, because I've seen too much illusions in my work and also among my colleagues what this process is concerned.
Too much
illusions, yeah, illusion. Hopeful, wishful thinking, wishful thinking. And if one looks at the reality as it is, really, this phenomenologically, one sees, yeah, it's far from ideal. It's far from catastrophic. Simply, it's very different from person to person. Everything we say in psychology about somebody, about ourselves, about somebody, is ultimately hypothesis. Hypothesis. Hermeneutically speaking, they are all hypotheses. No affirmation. I can make hypotheses, and it can be helpful, because hypotheses are questions, but open questions. If I give a diagnosis about this, let's say, a psychological constellation of somebody, and I make this diagnosis with the sense that this is it. This is it. That's now really the situation of this person, and I mean, take an example, very, very classical example is repressing its instincts, and one sees dreams in which the animals are getting wild, and then one can see, yeah, that's very typical of a repression of the instincts, and of course that's why this person is dreaming of animals becoming aggressive. Yes, as a hypothesis. But when I believe this, that this is now really, this is the situation of this person, I close something. I lock this person into something, even if I am not expressing it to the person.
In previous episodes, I spoke, for example, to Murray Stein about what we could learn maybe in analytical psychology from Christianity, a very broad question. But he said, well, I think we can learn to have faith. And he spoke of the faith in the process. He spoke about faith in the therapeutic room. And I was wondering, because now when you speak about agnosticism, you speak about keeping the I-thou relationship as a holy. We don't know.
Yeah.
Very much like that. But I'm wondering about the idea of faith. Is that then, excluded, or is that something that you actually see that we can sort of practice as an attitude as analysts?
That's also a very good question. You see, that's maybe where the question comes in about Islam, because Islam basically is acceptance, and this acceptance is not exactly identical with the Christian faith. A Christian faith contains also, I would say, acceptance to a certain extent, but it is it's of course it's a not a sharp distinction. It's rather a question of emphasis. In Christianity, the way I experienced it, at least that's again a subjective experience, of course, a personal experience. Faith means the outcome will be good. Outcome will be good. Whatever I fantasize when I say good, but God is love. God loves me. God has saved me through Jesus Christ. So the outcome can only be good if I have faith. Faith is the trust in this loving God, and then things in a way or another will be fine. From very concretistic beliefs in that a miracle will happen in the fundamentalistic churches to heal somebody completely, up to very highly spiritual way of experiencing this, that ultimately individuation process leads towards a good direction. And that a connection with the self and whatever, so-called self. Islam has, that's what interests me very much in the Islamic perception of the mystery. I would say is more open to the mystery. That God can also destroy. There's no happy end guaranteed. There's no guarantee that this is going to, everything is going to be fine. The contrary neither, because this abandonment, this giving abandonment to whatever Allah is, which the Muslim has not the slightest idea, in fact, what it is. This is really open. It's really open in the true believers. So if one looks at what image of God is this, it's an image of God which is completely mysterious, in the sense of does not go into a direction we can really sympathize with, because with our desire, our wish that things will be fine, and this gives basically, I would say, though of course in the sociological Islam it's different now. I mean, the ordinary believer probably would not accept what I'm saying here, but in my way of seeing this, it gives an openness to the mystery, which ultimately can only be described as agnostic. That's where I would make the link. We do not know.
When you speak like this, what I'm reminded of is Jesus on the cross, forsaken at the cross. Don't we find that also there? Or you mean that in Islam it's more integrated? Or
I see what you mean.
Story.
I would say it's to a certain extent more integrated. In that the wish, when the Muslim says inshallah, and if he's really a Muslim and belonging to the culture, he would really say, now if I say I will arrive, I will take the plane and I will arrive at 5 o'clock in Berlin, inshallah. He means there's a possibility that God brings the plane down. He has somewhere integrated this, inshallah. Of course, he hopes that the plane will arrive in Berlin safely, but he has integrated the possibility that the plane might crash. So it is really already the language, so God willing, inshallah means so God willing. I will arrive in Berlin at 5 o'clock. And this is a daily expression that, yes, that ultimately we do not know the will of God and the will of destiny, or however I want to call it.
And you feel sometimes in Christian thinkers that's lacking, or how Christianity has?
Yes, I mean, I would say this familiarity with God. Through especially also through Jesus Christ, who is our friend and close to us, one of us, and who is at the same time the Son of God, and this familiarity, one could almost say, from which, by the way, this sequence which you just reminded me of what happened on the cross, where Jesus said, "Why have you abandoned me?" This is very seldom is preached about. This is one of those passages which is not very often preached about in the churches, because it's very hard, does not fit very nicely into the Christian image of God, but it is a fact. God has become in Christianity, let's say in church Christianity, it's always difficult to know. It's difficult to say about which kind of God we are speaking. So I was speaking in the church God Christianity. Yes. A nice, good old friend who means good for me, and who asks me also to be good with my fellow man, but all this is very nice, and has lost to a large extent, at least in Protestantism now, its real mystery, its sense of mystery, and it's not enough to say, yes, God is unknown. You see what I mean? I mean, to preach that God is unknown and to verbalize all this. It's a question of sensing it. And it's interesting to see that already in the Orthodox Church, and this is again we have of course a connection that we said before, this sense of mystery. That God is really not just available to fulfill our wishes, but that He's really. The unknown also is much more strong. In the Russian Orthodox liturgy, you feel it, and the Pantokrator, this Christ figure in the top of the roof of the Orthodox churches, looking with terrible eyes down. He's not a nice fellow.
After finishing my training in Zurich, I was drawn into Luther and the theology of the cross,
right?
And especially how Luther speaks about how God works. He does his alien work. He's always working in opposites. So, I mean, in Luther, I think both the mystery and the cross and the paradox of suffering is very present. There's not this cozy identification with the God. There's not belief in only a good God. There's a surrender to God's will, yeah, mm-hmm. And there's the breaking of the will of the human will, yes, for the sake of God's.
I agree with you. I mean, there are many overlaps. It's a question of emphasis. I mean, I realize, by listening what you're saying, I am very much connected to Christianity the way I experienced it in my parish work and in my church work, and as a Christian in the churches, what I hear in the sermons, I grant with you absolutely that if you go into the deeper into the church fathers, into Thomas Aquinas, into Luther, into Calvin, you get and others, you get of course much more substantial, the type of perceptions of the mystery of God. I mean, this and of course of the place of the suffering. But what I still, despite that, my impression was, as I started to be in contact with the Islamic world, was that they, for some reason, better than the West, have kept the mystery of God, the sense of the mystery of God. Put it very simple. Of course, the interesting thing is that Westernized Muslims are the ones who give the how to say who are the birthplace, who are the breeding ground for the terrorists. It's very interesting to see that most of the people in ISIS and the people of 9/11 they were educated in a Western way, and then found again some kind of perverted connection to the sense of transcendence through their terroristic activities, bringing death and going themselves into death. But this death wish, this for others and for oneself, is of course connected with transcendence symbolically, and when transcendence is not experienced anymore psychologically, or one could say, then it can take this type of pathological shape that it has to be acted out, for instance, in terrorism. And but this is a small part of the Muslim world. I just experienced it very strongly in Egypt and later in Syria, and in Morocco, that the sense of the sense that human being is not in the center of the universe, to say this very simply, is lived. It's not a theoretical proposition. While in the West, for a reason which could be interesting to explore, that the human being is the alpha and omega of everything, is very, very strongly maintained, and even has become even more strongly since the diminishing of religion. But the sense that really God is the center of reality and not man, this is not something which you find in the West. Of course, you find it in some pockets and you find it in some books, but as a general tendency, finding it. Yeah, but it's really a general tendency in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
It's less anthropocentricity.
Staying with this, when you speak of Islam as acceptance and the theme around surrendering, I remember when you and me spoke some years ago, and you made me aware of that passage and that dream in Memories, Dreams and Reflections.
Mm-hmm.
Jung has a dream with his father. Here's a segment of that dream. If you want to listen to the whole dream, visit cross.center or go on YouTube and search for Psychology and the Cross.
In the dream, I suddenly saw that from the center, a steep flight of stairs ascended to a spot high up on the wall which no longer responded to reality. At the top of the stairs was a small door, and my father said, "Now I will lead you into the highest presence." Then he knelt down and touched his forehead to the floor. I imitated him, likewise kneeling, with great emotion. For some reason, I could not bring my forehead quite down to the floor. There was perhaps a millimeter to spare, but at least I had made the gesture with him. Suddenly I knew, or perhaps my father had told me, that the upper door led to a solitary chamber where lived Uriah, King David's general, whom David had shamefully betrayed for the sake of his wife, Bathsheba, by commanding his soldiers to abandon Uriah in the face of the enemy.
It's a very, very interesting passage in this book. They were bowing in front where the highest presence is. And in the highest presence sits, in the dream, it's in the dream, sits the general, I think it is Uriah,
Yep.
who has been badly betrayed by King David, because King David wanted his wife, and was sent even to a battle in a very dangerous situation, and was killed in this battle. What David in fact intended to do, and it is this so he could get his wife, the wife of this general, and this Uriah is so to speak the symbolic figure of this highest presence. My interpretation is then the following: is that what happened, because David then afterwards became King David and the author of the Psalms, and one of the very important figures in Judaism, the father of Solomon, and a king who was very close to Yahweh, and all this. My interpretation would be the following: that what happened to this poor general Uriah, is an absolute how to say it? It's an incredible abuse. This King David wanted to snatch the wife of the general, and sent it, thanks to his power given by the way by God, by Yahweh, he sends this general to the front line so that the general gets killed, and that then David can take the wife. This is just a horrible deed. The king, the general Uriah, was the victim of a fantastic injustice, but of a fantastic injustice, which is difficult to qualify from a normal moral ethical point of view, which was happening by a king chosen by God, by King David. So we have here a complete paradox. This Uriah for me represents the symbolic figure of somebody who is suffering. Of course, then we have the suffering of unjust suffering, completely unjust, and this unjust suffering seems to be somewhere connected with the will of God. God let it happen, at least, but God let it even happen through somebody who is his own king. That's the difference between Jung and his father. That it seems that his father seems to represent symbolically in the dream that he is bowing in front of the total mystery of God, including the injustice of God, producing the suffering of Uriah, or having allowed the suffering of Uriah. He is in a full attitude of acceptance. He touches ground with his forehead. Jung is not at the point of this dream, is not able to do it. And there is not able because he wanted to do it. The dream says, I wanted to do it, but I did not succeed. So there is something in him resisting this total surrender. I am not a second blaming Jung for not having touched with his forehead the ground, but the self-explanation which he gives in his memory dreams of reflections, why he did not touch it, for me seems to be a little bit constructed. That this means the freedom of man. He has to safeguard a little bit the freedom in front of the Almighty God. This is constructed because in the symbolism of freedom, or in the theological symbolism of freedom, there is not an opposition between freedom and God. God, the quality of God, gives also freedom to man. It's a reductive understanding of freedom, almost infantile reduction of freedom, to see God as a father who prevents his little boy, to be free. This is a rather superficial understanding of the connection between determination and freedom. In Islam, especially for instance in Ibn Arabi, he has written a lot of things about this. The paradox is that the closer we are to God, the more we are free. And this closeness to God means also surrender, includes of course surrender. It's very interesting that he had this dream in Tunisia, where he was absolutely, he had it in Tunisia, where he mentions in his memory, dreams and reflection that he was very much impressed by the call to prayer, which he heard, from the minarets 5 times a day, very much impressed, and which are in fact the call to go to pray, but the prayer, the Islamic prayer is a prayer of surrender. It's not a prayer of give me this, give me that, save this, help me for that, save my soul or whatever. It's an expression of surrender. We find also in the Christian prayer, of course, but there it is very, very emphasized. So Jung was impressed by this, and then he reacted like that. This is dream. Yeah.
So what would you say? What was lacking in Jung at that time?
He had a dream in the 1920s, and I think in the 1920, he still had not experienced all of his psychic possibilities. The old Jung in the BBC interview, I think it was 1 year before his death, when this journalist asks him, "Do you believe in God?" and Jung answers, "I know." There is surrender. There is surrender. I heard more surrender. I know.
Can you say something more about that?
Yes, because in the meantime, Jung had experienced his heart attack. This was after the long time after the dream in Tunisia, he had experienced his heart attack, and in his heart attack, which he also mentions, in his dream and memories of reflection, he was very close from dying, and he was called back to go back to Earth. He was already in the cosmos. He had some kind of inner vision. And during his coma situation, he was in the coma. And then a voice told him, I remember if it was a voice, but he just felt that somebody, some power, something mysterious, told him, no, you have to go down again into life. And this was, of course, a basic religious experience, which he did not have yet at the time of the dream in Tunis.
2 episodes ago, I spoke to Amy Cook, which is a scholar mostly studying Kierkegaard and the relationship to Jungian psychology. She wrote an excellent book on that as well. She takes this statement of Jung as a representation of his difficulties with faith, or that he does not, when it comes to faith, she says he is not open. There is no dynamism. There's no dialectic anymore. There's a knowing, so there's no faith.
Yeah. Then we have a different perception of the way he spoke. Yeah, I listened to it many times because I was also very intrigued by this I know, and I just got every time since the very beginning, it did not change, the impression that he said it because of an inner experience. And you see, this is in fact, I would even say, more religious than just faith. You see, because faith, you can to a certain extent. I believe because it's absurd. I believe because it is absurd. there's a church father, Tertullian, who said, credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd. The more it is foolish, the more I believe. Okay, but that's well, maybe a beginning, but that's not yet the deep religious experience. In Jung's, I know that's maybe my subjective, perception, but I perceive the result of an experience, which you could call mystical or name it. I mean, that's not important. But of an experience not just of one experience, you see what I mean? Not just one event, but of a growing into this perception, which allows him then to say, I know. And not that I know in the sense of I know that the brain has two halves, which is also can also use the word no, I know that the brain has two halves. Okay, I know that there are two halves. But the intonation in which he says it is absolutely not the one of this kind. You see what I mean? I know that the brain has two halves.
I think, yeah, I agree. And I think many people would agree that, there's no doubt that he had these experiences that made him understand that there is other powers. That's somehow clear to me as well. And so you can have many of those experiences, but it's not faith. I mean, faith also has to do with the end of life, or with the eschatology, or it's also a question about, what do we have faith in, or what's that highest presence that Jung couldn't bow to? I'm wondering still, about this, what he couldn't bow to.
You see, I mean, there we come. I mean, I cannot answer to that. I did not speak to him, and he did not write anything about that. It's simply there is maybe one little indication which shows, of course, Jung's own ambivalence. In fact, what this question is concerned, because or let's say possible answer to this question. When he speaks, I once made a little checkup of the passages in which he speaks about the transcendent function, and the famous when he says the Deo concedente, God willing, the individuation process will go like this and that, or what he wrote on his over the door of his house in Küsnacht. What vocatus ad non vocatus Deus aderit, called or not called, God will be here. The transcendent function sometimes is clearly only psychological in some of his expressions. I don't have now the quotes in my head, but I have it written somewhere. One sees it's a psychological function, and at one point it intervenes. It's the third, which results from the tension between the two, and it is as such a new situation which comes about from the dialectic between the two, and so. But there are other places where it is quite explicitly metaphysical, and where the God willing, Deo concedente, seems to come from the other side, from the metaphysical side. But Jung himself does not clarify this. Well, one just can notice that there are quotes about the transcendent function, which sometimes lean more towards something inner psychic, or let's say purely psychological, and sometimes lean towards something metaphysical, in the true sense, not pure mystery, not reducible to a psychological phenomenon. I cannot say more. So I have the impression that also your question somewhere, he was moving in this realm till the end of his life, with probably some more confidence at one point, some more surrender. It's interesting, if one sees the Red Book, just to come to this, there are many places in which his paintings, in his paintings figure Islamic buildings. Many places, there are about 10 buildings. Of course, they are not in the center, they are somewhere in a corner, but there are little buildings with a cupola which are looking like mosques. So the theme of surrender is haunting him from the very beginning. I think he was deeply impressed somewhere by the motive of surrender, but at the same time resisting it.
I hear how you were drawn into, your Islamic studies, and I hear the depth and the importance that it has had for you psychologically. And I see, well, if I go out from my practice and I go 100 meters, there's a little mosque. Every day, young men coming with their carpets, running, to them.
Yeah.
There's a pull, there's an energy. And at the same time, in my little life in Berlin, trying to enter a church, usually it's closed. Or it's rented out for some events,
Yes.
Or you come on a Sunday and you sit down with a group of elderly people, nothing wrong with that.
I understand.
So there is something, here that we're standing in the middle of.
Yes, you see, I mean, I hear you very, very well, and I must really say that this speaks very much to me also. I mean, what you feel here, it's, you see, simply what my impression is this, that, but it's of course a very personal hypothesis, that this new God, which in fact Jung was trying, or no, not his subconscious was trying to communicate it to him, particularly through the Red Book also, and wrestling with Christianity, for sure. But this wrestling with something with a psychic reality, with a spiritual reality, who was still very much alive to a certain extent, but which was already on its way out. The Islamic reality as such, with its ethnological aspects, is not necessarily the reality in its way in, because Islam needs also a lot of reformation, this I'm sure. It has shapes which for a Westerner are difficult to follow. It has a lot of Arabisms, which do not correspond to our own psyche. So it is not easy to become a Muslim, to live as for a Westerner. But there is something in Islam which I think is highly symbolical of a general movement happening in mankind now, and a general movement to which Christianity is, how to say, in regards to which Christianity is outdated. And this is to a certain extent outdated. It has, of course, a lot of things which will be carried on, but in one main point is outdated. And this is, that's my hypothesis. I know this can be attacked, but I'm deeply convinced that at least there's some truth in it. And this is the anthropocentricity of Christianity. That we must not, Christianity is based on Judaism, and then it became with Jesus Christ to be Christianity, but first it was based on Judaism. And Judaism is a religion in which God, Yahweh, suddenly takes very, very serious the well-being and the destiny of one particular group of human beings. This is amazing, and enters into the history, even intervenes in this history of this little group, helping them to get out of Egypt, to go into the promised land, and to fight all the pagans who are, by the way, nature God believers. They were believing that nature has still something divine. They were fought mercilessness and God in the name of God. So first a human group was highly valued, the Hebrews, and then mankind as such, humanity as such, was highly valued. God became man. God did not become an animal or a cosmos or nature, became man. So there we have mythologically speaking, tremendous emphasis upon the value of human being, which of course then led the foundation of a perception of the value of human needs. Human needs. If human being is so valuable, then his needs are of course very valuable. And there we have then the American Constitution, the fundamental right of freedom, of blah blah, of happiness, of and so forth. That humanity and its needs, and then ultimately we have of course the consumer society, which then at one point of course produces this perversity that when natural needs are satisfied, one has to begin to produce artificial needs in order to satisfy the market. You know this better than myself. So this anthropocentricity that's my impression, is coming to an end, and is coming to an end because not because of some kind of metaphysical reason, but because we see the effect it has had now upon the planet. It has for a long time. It has allowed a better life for humanity, but with the industrial revolution and the technological explosion, one cannot name it different or otherwise, it is beginning now to destroy the planet and the very foundations on which this human life is possible. So this anthropocentricity is showing now its dark side, and which means centricity upon human desires and their satisfaction. And this, I think, is the beginning of a change of civilization. And there, of course, Islam, with its theocentricity, with God being really the center, the mystery of which is also in the cosmos, which why not? There might be some extra terrestrial beings landing one of those days, which is behind also them, I think is more relevant for today than anthropocentricity, and especially for the future. And that's why I think that's why some people feel this in Islam. They feel it and are attracted by the theocentricity of Islam. And I must say, I myself, that's also through this way that I began to have my interest for Islam. So I felt, this is not going to solve our human problems. This is really giving again a place, a big place, the most important place, by the way, to the origin of life and of death and of everything. And giving it in an existential way and not just philosophically.
I feel like I need to ask you a very personal question, and you can decide how you like and if you like to answer to it. And do you believe in God?
In that sense, yes, the way you just said, yes. But with that full stop, full stop.
It doesn't matter if it's a Christian or a Muslim God.
Absolutely.
No.
And I would just say in the various religious expressions, I sense something of within God. Also in Buddhism, because if they say we are not, we don't believe in God, but they behave, like people who are open to the mystery. That's why I prefer to call it the mystery simply. If we have to, by all means, to use a word, I prefer this one.
Did this episode evoke any thoughts, ideas, or reflections that you'd like to share? Do you have any questions? Please share your thoughts with me on cross.center/feedback. cross.center/feedback.